Now that you've mastered purpose and creating context, and then focus, creating a thesis statement and staying focused on that particular thing, support where you provide support for your essay, and language where you're considering how best to say those things, the best vocabulary, grammar, etc. It is now time to consider structure, which is your choice of how to organize ideas and make them flow in a logical way for your reader. So you can see that all of this is in support of your really important idea. So that idea is always going to be central, figuring out what it is that you have to say. And so make sure that that's always central, that you have something interesting to say and that you want to say what you have to say. You'll notice here the 3 different sections of the rubric for structure. And you'll see that the first one, number 1, says that it provides coherence, your writing provides coherence with a progression of ideas and support. So this is where you have thought very carefully about what the best way to organize the ideas in your essay is. And there are lots and lots of different ways to organize any particular idea in a logical flow. And then also you're thinking about, has the support that you have integrated, does that come at the right time in a way that's logical for your reader, and in a way that they can connect your ideas to your support, to the support that you have. And then the second area here is about transitioning between ideas, paragraphs, and sentences. So here, it includes having a beginning and ending to each specific idea and figuring out how that relates to a whole. So that is the organization of each paragraph in relation to other paragraphs. And then the second bullet point here is about each sentence in the paragraph. Do those ideas connect and flow with itself, using those relationship words to show, why am I going next to this particular thing? The third part of the thesis right here has to do with introductions and conclusions, presenting insightful, original, or compelling introductions and conclusions. So that the introduction, you can see the goal to the introduction is to transition the reader from their world into your paper, and gives them a reason to read on. And then your conclusion is going to transition them from your paper back to the world and say, okay, what should I take away from this? So you can see that transitions, that structure is all about those transitions, and how you're going to create things after you've created an overall structure, how you're going to get from one thing to the next. So we have the idea of the introduction going from the world to your paper, recognizing that your audience is not already ready to hear about your ideas. They might have just finished doing the dishes, or done another, doing a math homework or something like that. And so you've got to find a way to catch their attention and say, okay, now are you ready to read about X, whatever it is that's in your paper? And so that can be a really big idea, and we'll take a look at an example of how one does that, and then consider how to do it specifically in your NFFs. Then the next transition is from idea to idea. This could be, like I said earlier, in the paragraph to paragraph way of thinking about it, or sentence to sentence. So not just, so everything flows and has a reason to go from one thing to the next. Then it's also about transitions between your ideas and the ideas of the other author, and the specific support. What's the relationship between those ideas? Are they connected clearly? And this is where we're going to talk about those things, like if you've ever had a teacher say that you have hanging quotations, or tells you to do better lead-ins. this is what they are talking about, is this particular idea, is going from your ideas to the support and potentially back again. These arrows, while they look like they go one direction, continue from one direction to and back. And then finally, we've got that idea of conclusion, where we're going from your paper back to the real world. So what should somebody take out of your paper? Also, all of this stuff is within your paper, and then we're going from the world and then back to the world. And so all of those things are really key in your structure. And every decision that you make whenever you're writing should be a conscious decision. That's key, whether you're talking about language, whether you're talking about your focus, which support to include. And that's the hardest part about all of these, is making sure that writing is a conscious process. It is not just something I hear frequently, and it's developmentally appropriate that students talk about how hard it is to get the ideas that are in their heads onto paper. And that happens to even the most professional of writers. But the key is to think purposefully about what is it that I want to say and what is the best way to say that. And that is never a quick and natural thing. It's something that requires a lot of encoding and decoding. So the first piece that we want to talk about is that transition from the world to your paper. So how are you going to get there? And so here we're looking at this sample essay by Joan Quarterman. It's an older essay, but it's a really interesting one called "Only Her Hairdresser: Another Look at Daisy Buchanan." And so you can see that the introduction, which is located here, I want you to take a look at how long that introduction is. And this is a 5-page paper. So if you look at this and you're saying, okay, it's a little bit less than a half of a page because there are footnotes, then you're looking at about 10% of the paper. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb to consider, that 10% of a paper is a reasonable length for an introduction. And so if you're writing a 1-page paper, your introduction cannot be a quarter of a page or a half of a page long. So you have to think about, okay, how am I going to get the elements of that introduction in transitioning my reader to the world, from the world to my paper, to my ideas, and making them want to listen to me in just probably a sentence or two, and getting to my thesis statement very, very quickly. So you can see that Corman has started out talking about, in a 1972 newspaper article, a Hollywood columnist and a Fitzgerald intimate. So you can see that that's that context piece that we talked about earlier. We're creating context and purpose for reading, is we're saying, hey, or you could also consider that as the they say. Right, is that this person has said that Ally McGraw was not an appropriate choice to play Daisy Buchanan in this film of The Great Gatsby. And people, and in transitioning somebody from the world to my paper, somebody might say, oh, I'm interested. I read newspapers, I watch movies, and I've considered like casting in these movies. And if I've read a book, to say, hey, that's not the right person to play that part. So that's a good way. It's not flashy. It's not those things that you learned in middle school about, hey, throw in a definition or ask a question or a surprising fact. It's just a way to say, hey, here's some things that you might be familiar with before I get into my real deep literary argument that you might not be quite ready for. So don't worry about the flash of a hook, because this is a hook. And some people are really good at writing a flashy hook that makes sense. But if that's not you, that's not a problem. It doesn't have to be flashy. And so here we've got this idea that she's a bad casting because she's dark, instead of Fitzgerald's character that's blonde, blue-eyed, feminine, and frivolous. And then we move into the actual argument. So this gets into the I say portion. And you can see how quickly this happens even in a 5-page paper, and you'll need to do it even more quickly in a 1-page paper. So if you're looking at an overall literary essay, you're going to take a little bit more time to do it if you're writing 4 or 5 or 6 pages. But if you're only writing a page, it's got to happen very, very quickly, maybe a sentence for each, right? So here, this person transitions quickly to that the novel both supports and refutes her, and there's contradictions. You'll see sentence to sentence continuity here, right? That there is contradictory ways, and then this contradictory can be explained by dual origin, and then again another idea. So we've got a lot of ideas that are flowing from one to the next here. So recognize that. The other thing that I want you to think about as we are thinking about introductions is this is starting to show the overall structure and organization that this author has decided on for her paper. And you'll notice that the first sentence here says that Fitzgerald offers varying descriptions of Daisy's hair color. This tells me that that the purpose, your first sentence often gives of a paragraph often says what the purpose of that paragraph is. And so here, even in your one-page paper, you're thinking potentially about paragraphing. But in a one-page paper, you may only have one paragraph that's only supporting your thesis in a very, very small way because you've likely narrowed it down to a single example, in which case you could have a real quick introductory paragraph of 2 sentences, and then all of your evidence, support, analysis, etc., and then you can move into some other things. So you can see that the purpose of this particular paragraph is to offer specific support and evidence for the fact that there are different descriptions of Daisy's hair color. And that's all you need to know about that particular paragraph. And you can say, okay, I know what's coming. I know what's going to be included in this paragraph. As we move on to the next paragraph, you can see that there is a transition word. Okay, so here we're looking to transition from paragraph to paragraph on this slide. And so here, the last paragraph had the purpose of introducing some of those specific differences and descriptions of Daisy's hair color in the text. This one says that it's also in the manuscript. So this phrase of additional instances tells us what the relationship between one paragraph, the first paragraph, and this paragraph is. So it's a conscious decision, letting the reader know exactly how we are moving from one thing to the next. Then you can see the next transition from paragraph to paragraph. And again, we're seeing the overall structure of the piece here. So this one we're looking at the differences in manuscript. And then as our transition piece, we have these conflicting images and why. Okay, so what is where does this difference come from? So here it's a question of origin, right? If we're talking about those questions that we talked about at the beginning of the year. So recognizing those particular ideas. Please also notice in here, you can see some short sentences that numerous details support this dual identification. That is a key idea, and you'll notice that the longer sentences have the explanation and analysis. So recognize those particular details. As we transition to the next paragraph, and this will go to the next slide, is that now we're acknowledging why this is important, and also how the reader responds to it. You might consider this as the beginning of a naysayer paragraph as you look at the introductory sentence here. What is curious is that although the fair and dark descriptions fair and dark descriptions seem well balanced, most readers come away from the novel convinced that Daisy's blonde. So there you've got a recognition that some people might argue against that. So as we look at this potential naysayer paragraph, where it's saying, okay, like, what does the reader bring from the story in order to, and why do they think that Daisy is blonde, even though the balanced descriptions, both in the manuscript and the final draft, have both that blonde and brunette evidence. And here we can see further what this author's organization is. In this particular paragraph deals with the color gold, and then this one deals with the color white, and where those might be important. And so make sure that you see the transition there. We've got evidence in this paragraph for all of the gold stuff, and then your transition. We've got the pot of gold as our last sentence here, and connecting it to the fair-haired. So this is our analysis at the end of the paragraph. And then here our transition says, the golden girl dwells in a high white palace, giving us a nice transition from gold to white, and saying that white rivals gold. So that's a transition, even though it's not a whereas or a therefore or a but. It connects the two ideas concretely and moves us from the idea of gold to white, and why that's important. So we've got some stuff that's a little bit gold and white as we move on to white on its own, and what white means as far as that is. So white is closer in appearance to light hair than dark, the purity and innocence of it. This is all the analysis part, so you're considering that as well. But so we're looking at some of the sentence to sentence transitions as we consider, we've got some evidence here, and then we say, as scores of critics have noted, and that gives us more information about it. And then we've got the word even when Gatsby first meets her. So we're still transitioning. And then we've got this like gold down here. White undoubtedly reinforces. So again, it connects us to the ideas that we've already seen. We're not leaving them. We're just building and building and building on top of. Then we've also got this idea of more significantly, though. So again, that goes to our analysis, and why it's important is for the purity and innocence. And then we're going into other fair-haired women and examples, and then our concluding idea is, and we also have, let's look within, this colon here serves as an introduction to a list, and that's one of the valid uses for that piece of punctuation. And the semicolons here separate items in a list when the items in a list are longer or have commas within them. So then again, we've got that paragraph that wraps up everything there and gets us ready for the next paragraph, where we're getting into, as you can read the transition from one to the next, we're getting into more complexity. So not just that the color symbolism, it would be a mistake, however, so you can see that transition language, to think that color symbolism alone gives rise to the impression that Daisy is blonde. So here we're going from color symbolism and then to characterization, so adding some more complex. And so on this slide, you will continue to see, the things that I talked about before. But you're also going to see us transitioning from the author's own ideas specifically into that support. And here, this is where I told you, if you've ever had a teacher talk about hanging quotations, and that means just having a quotation just dropped in there as if it's his own sentence, as if it flows. But what you want to do instead is you want your ideas to be central, and you want the support that you're using to be integrated within your argument. And this author does this really well in that she never uses a whole sentence from Fitzgerald, but rather these little bits and pieces, like unquestionable practicality. You'll remember that quotation from the book, and I know that it's on our notes somewhere. So you can see that she incorporates the quotation along with this wholesome bulkiness about his person and position in regards to Tom. But you'll notice that the rest of that, so it's within the author's own argument, like Alice Munro, Daisy is passive. So that's the argument, that's the claim that we are backing up with dropping in particular quotes along with paraphrase. So we only use the words that are the words themselves that are absolutely necessary, where the words that Fitzgerald or the author used are absolutely critical to getting that idea across. The rest of it, the ideas, the summary that Tom is wealthy and solid, and that Gatsby is dashing, and that that she loves them. The unquestionable practicality and the wholesome bulkiness are the keys to the argument here, and the words matter. So this author has built them in to that particular thing. Please note as you do this that this is a different form of citation, and in MLA this would work for the most part, except we would not have the P's at all in our citations. We would just have the page numbers. And why don't we need to say Fitzgerald 181, 182? It's because it's already implied. We have said that we are talking about Daisy, which means that we're talking about Hawthorne, and it is implied that it is not from The Last of the Mohicans or the Blithedale Romance. We are talking back again about Daisy and The Great Gatsby. So it would be redundant for us to put that name in there because all of our quotes, unless specifically stated otherwise, are from Fitzgerald. So that's why we don't have that there. So again, let's take a look at some more of that, of how she has integrated these ideas. You can see here a lot of the my ideas, right? These are the author's ideas that like her blonde literary forebears, she comes from acceptable Anglo-Saxon stock. We might question that a little bit just in Tom's characterization and his pause before including her as part of the white race, but that might be something that this person would want to deal with in a naysayer, but I'm not sure that they have. So we can always continue to question these authors as well. But you will see that this is all of my ideas, and then again we're going to we've got some analysis of what we've said previously, and why that kind of sterile blondness exists, yes, and then this is the analysis of why and how, and interpretation. Please note that the way that this author has built in these quotations, the lead-ins, it's all part of the idea and sentence that's already there. And if we don't have a specific interjection word like says or argues, then we do not, so for that we would have a comma. Notice that for these there is no comma because it flows, the idea flows directly through. You should be able to read, and if I were reading this out loud, you wouldn't necessarily know where the quotations started and ended because it works absolutely perfectly with the grammar that already exists there in the sentence and in the paragraph. And that's key for integrating quotations. It shouldn't be like, hey, here's something completely different. It's just using those things. My inflection would probably tell you what's quote and what's not, but you want to be able to notice that. So here you can see that the ideas in the paper now have gotten to the idea of not just color, but blondness as coldness. And an anesthetic kind of, and that's where we've kind of gotten through this paragraph. And then again, we have that transition, but side by side with the sexually anesthetic blonde is the dark-haired Daisy. So now that's a very, very specific transition that says, blonde was there, now we're going to talk about the brunette, the dark-haired. And then we say the jaded, cynical, young sophisticate. And gets, again, integrated that quotation right in there, and then actually integrated straight with, again, this part is argument, right? and interpretation of one's own. So you can see how it all just melds together. It's not like, here I'm going to say my idea, and then I'm going to say what somebody else said, and then I'm going to tie it together. Ideally, it gets all worked in together seamlessly. The idea that the dark woman exudes sexuality, and things like that. Then we have our final page. We'll mention it. Our final page, where let's talk a little bit about the conclusion, because we will finish up with the complexity of this argument, where we've got these transitions like, but if Daisy is this, perhaps it is this, and all of those considerations of all of the complexity. Nick too recognizes this and that. And so here, notice how small this conclusion is, and remember that the purpose of a conclusion is to go from the paper, all of this complex literary argument that we've done, and bring it back to the reader's world. So thinking about, okay, what do we want the reader to take away from this? We could certainly apply it to a major concept, but you can see here that this author hasn't necessarily gone that far. Starts the conclusion with, okay, so I have said this. It may be true that this is what happens. I've proven this, and that leaves us with the, okay, so now what? It is true that this is the case. And then, but more is involved, so he's kind of, she is restating her ideas here and tying it all together in a much more concise way to say, here's what's important about Daisy's potential for both blonde and brunette hair and what we need to take away. And then we've got this idea of, in his creation of Daisy, Fitzgerald reflects the influence of this tradition, and that the character is both cool, innocent princess and femme fatale. These are both ideas that that any reader would be able to identify outside, right? We might think about Disney princesses and Sleeping Beauty and blah, 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 versus those kind of dark women in, like Fatal Attraction or something like that, even though she's technically blonde. But still, and then we get to this idea of Daisy's enigmatic charm. And this actually is the connection to the world, is like, why do people find Daisy interesting? Because Daisy is one that you'll hear about over and over and over and over again. And that's this author's connection to the real world, is what makes it interesting. What matters is that people take note of these types of literary tropes and expectations and consider them in why do we find Daisy either likable or unlikable. And even more than that, he's kind of found her humanity, that she's not just good or just sexual or something like that. One of our dark people, our femme fatales, would be Hester Prynne. I don't know if you noticed that as we went through the paper. But that shows all of the transitions. So I hope that you can use this as a good example of a literary or analytical paper that incorporates quotes, thinks about the organization and structure. I hope that you can see that this author might have chosen a very, very different organizational structure. Instead of going from the actual text to the influences to the different colors and what it means, could have done all of the brown-haired stuff and all of the blonde-haired stuff together, or could have done all kinds of different things. But once you've settled on what the best organization is, making sure that your transitions support that is what all of this is about. So I wish you luck. Please use this as an example, and consider that this paragraph is likely in a one-page paper only about a sentence, is you've got to make it matter in just a sentence. If you've got any questions, please see your teacher.